Estamos con Elizabeth David Barret de la Universidad de Sussex en el Reino Unido. Elizabeth, welcome to Mexico. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great having you here. The first question is about those concepts, inequality and corruption. We may think that these concepts are not necessarily related. What do you think about it?
I think actually there are quite a lot of ways in which they can be related. So definitely corruption can exacerbate inequality, and also actually inequality can make it harder to fight corruption in some ways, I think. So to give you an example of corruption exacerbating inequality, look at something like healthcare policy. If healthcare policy is captured by certain interest groups, then that can mean that it has really negative outcomes for some groups. So, for example, take something like sugar. If the sugar lobby is very strong, perhaps it influences the government not to introduce public health policies that would actually be very good for the population. And that can exacerbate inequality by sort of adding to the public health burden.
Or education. Maybe.
Education would be another example, absolutely. Again, if certain interest groups benefit from a fairly elitist education system, and so they would be lobbying the government to try to have a fairly elitist system, don't really mind that much about sort of spreading education, then that just exacerbates inequality. Then you get a situation where only a certain proportion of the population is educated very well, and it turns out that they also happen to have good social connections to certain people that they went to school with. It becomes even harder for those people who didn't go to the good schools. They not only did they not get the good education, but they also didn't get the opportunity to meet the people who wield power, the movers and shakers.
There's this assumption that the developed economies doesn't have corruption trouble, but they actually have. Anyways, they have processes, they have many ways that they take these cases. Where do you see this, what type of controls do they have to narrow the corruption?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would say that every society has corruption. There's no society
more or less.
Yeah, I mean, it varies. The types of corruption vary. In the UK, there's no way you have to pay a bribe to get a passport. In some developing countries you do. That would be the norm. So it varies, but certainly all countries have some kind of corruption. And how countries that deal with it better deal with it is by having a sophisticated ecosystem of checks and balances, institutions that hold one another to account, civil society that is free and can speak and mobilize people to take action, and also openness and transparency so people can see what government is doing and start to ask questions about it and hold government to account. Freedom of the media is extremely important. So the societies that control corruption well, they do it by having this ecosystem of institutions and checks on power.
And how do you mobilize a society like Mexican where we have many trouble to participating in the public affairs? What do you can recommend about it?
Well, I think you need to start standing up in small, minor situations for integrity. So when you see a little transgression, a little unethical behavior or corruption, you need to just push back a little bit and say, hang on, do you really want to behave in that way? Just start to question these things, I think, so that you start to upset the sort of norms that people take for granted. Use people's anger about things like inequality and say, well, what do you think the root of that is? What can we do to address that? And I think also give people hope. So I'm quite a strong believer that actually often, even when you see a lot of corruption, there are many, many people behind that who don't want to be behaving corruptly and they feel ashamed of it. And they would much rather be in a society where they don't feel that they have to behave corruptly. So if you give people the hope that you can achieve that and you have a credible way of achieving that, actually people can switch quite quickly into different patterns.
About Mexico, what do you think about the institutional efforts that we have made in order to fight against corruption. I'm referring to the approval of the national anti-corruption system. How do you see this phenomenon from distance?
Well, I mean, it seems very promising. This seems like this takes on the approach of building this ecosystem. So you don't put anti-corruption just in the hands of one agency, which would then be liable to influence or politicization, and you get back to the same old problems. But you spread around that responsibility for checking power and holding government to account among many institutions. So it seems to me that that's a very promising approach.
Finally, let's talk about loopholes. These ways of avoiding the law, and that make things easier to the corrupt politicians. Sorry. Is there any kind of method, indicators, processes that can help the legal statements that can help the law in order to fight corruption?
Well, I think there are two things. One is to just keep watching everything. So have as many people watching and observing and asking questions as possible, and pick out where there seem to be loopholes and where they're being exploited. The second thing is really about this changing norms again and building new norms. So I think that in the long run, if you really want sustainable change, then you've got to have people who want to behave in a non-corrupt way. It's not just good enough to have people who don't behave corruptly because they're frightened of being caught. You've got to have people who just want to do the right thing. So that's much more about building the norms, shaming people when they don't stick to them, calling people out on it, and then I think you build actually quite sustainable long-term change.
In Mexico, you say that we have to create new norms, but in Mexico we have created a lot of new norms in the past 2 years, and there's a trouble passing from norms to the execution, the execution of the norm. Mm-hmm. What's the challenge, or what's the key in that process that you see about it? Mm.
Well, I think so. The laws and norms go hand in hand. You've got to do both things, and the laws play a role in setting the standard and telling people, this is what you need to aspire to. But the norms do need to come along as well. I think what you need there is you need sort of mechanisms that tie people in to behaving in line with the norm and give them benefits for doing so. So creating clubs and collective action where people can say proudly that they engage, they behave in the non-corrupt way. And once that they've said that out loud, then you can hold them to that and shame them if they don't. So I think the more collective action and anti-corruption kind of clubs you can create, the more this starts to spread.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your ideas, for your thoughts, for your information about corruption. We take them to improve what we are doing in order to fight effectively corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for the invitation.
Estuvimos con Elizabeth David Barret de la Universidad de Sussex. Yo soy Jesús Caudillo. Nos vemos a la siguiente. Hasta entonces.